Well, welcome back, everybody. Concept 2, dealing with Reconstruction, discuss the presidential plan of Reconstruction and show how its weaknesses led to the Congressional plan of Reconstruction. So, in a proclamation on December 8th, 1863, while the war was still going on, Lincoln formulated what was to be the basis of the presidential plan of Reconstruction. The objective of Lincoln's plan was to get the people from the seceded states back into the normal relations with the federal government as quickly as possible. The tool Lincoln would use was his presidential power of pardon. As stated under the discussion on the proclamation, Lincoln's main objective was to preserve the Union. He felt that trying to get to get a pound of flesh from the South after the war would only keep the nation divided longer and would not provide any common good for the majority of Americans. The South would only resist black equality and thereby delay the healing process of the nation's wounds. Hence, Lincoln found it to be the best interest of the nation to use his presidential power of pardon to get the seceded states back into their normal relationship with the federal government as quickly as possible and as painlessly as possible. In using his power of pardon, Lincoln provided for a general amnesty and restoration of property other than slaves to most of those who would take a prescribed oath of loyalty to the Union. Furthermore, when 10% of the electorate, people who could vote, of 1860 took this oath, a state government would be established, which Lincoln promised to recognize as the true government of the state. Under this, they could hold constitutional conventions and draw up and ratify new constitutions that abolish slavery. The people within these states were then prepared to have their state resume its normal place in the federal union. This would be done after the reconstructed state governments and elected officials to both House and Congress at the federal level. Lincoln's plan used in Tennessee and promptly adopted in Louisiana and Arkansas. But all was not so easy as Congress, which is the judge of its own membership, refused to admit representatives of the reconstructed states. And in the presidential election of 1864, the electoral votes were not counted of those states that Lincoln saw fit to bring back into the Union. The congressional reaction to Lincoln's plan obviously was not positive. The congressional leader had a plan of their own which carefully retained control of the entire process of Reconstruction in congressional hands. However, the assassination in April of 1865 ended his program and brought Vice President Andrew Johnson to the White House with the second phase of the presidential plan of Reconstruction. Before Johnson's plan of Reconstruction is discussed, oh, never mind. I'll just go into his plan. Andrew's rise to the presidency drastically altered the political situation, although, like Lincoln, he viewed the restoration of the southern states as presidential, not a congressional function, obviously. So he's going to have a lot of problems, Andrew Johnson, assuming presidency. First and foremost, he's not Lincoln, right? And so that's a problem. Like, he could have been anybody, and not being Lincoln is going to be a big problem because Lincoln had quite a bit of political capital for having the forthright and the vision to pursue the Civil War and maintain the integrity of the Union. The second thing that's going to be against him is he's a Democrat, and so Lincoln brought him on board in his second term to maintain the loyalty of the northern of the border states that had maintained slavery and were loyal to the Union. and he was hoping that this would be an indication of his sincerity in healing the nation as quickly as possible by bringing a Democrat on board as opposed to a Republican once the war was over, right? And so it was basically communicating to the South, I'm not going to take a pound of flesh from you guys just because we're going to win this war. So that's another thing. He's a Democrat, right? And Congress is going to be run by the Republicans. So that's going to be a problem. And two, he had a bit of a drinking problem, and that's going to get in the way of things. So Johnson was a war Democrat from a seceded state. He had been placed on the same ticket with Lincoln in 1864 to emphasize the unionism of the Republican Party. Like John Tyler in 1841, Johnson was the nominal head of a party of which he was not a member. Few, if any, presidents ever faced a more difficult situation. Johnson had no personal following with the American people, either in the South or in the North, so this is another problem Johnson is going to have. Nor did he have the prestige of Lincoln, obviously. Finally, Johnson had no party organization behind him, for he had broken with the Democratic Party and had not been fully accepted by the Republicans. In the beginning, however, some radical Republicans did rejoice in the death of Lincoln and the accession of Johnson, as a quote from Representative George Julian of Indiana indicates. Quote, I spent most of the afternoon in a political caucus, and while everyone was shocked at his murder, the feeling was nearly universal that the accession of Johnson to the presidency would prove a godsend to the country. Aside from Mr. Lincoln's known policy of tenderness to the rebels, his views of the subject of Reconstruction were as distasteful as possible to radical Republicans. Unquote. Immediately upon accession to the presidency, Johnson appeared to be willing to cooperate with the radical Republicans. Johnson stated that, quote, treason is a crime and must be punished, unquote. But once Congress was out of session, he started moving in a sharply different direction. This was partly because Johnson viewed Reconstruction as a presidential, not a congressional function. Two, like Lincoln, Johnson, also self-educated and self-trained, he had a powerful, though not well-disciplined mind. Combined with these intellectual qualities were the virtues of integrity, devotion to duty, courage, and a belief in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. But at a time when the tact and flexibility were called for, he was stubborn and inflexible. Johnson's own blunders isolated him not from the radical Republicans, but from the party of moderates. And three, as a result of these blunders, the radicals, who were a minority at the outset of Johnson's administration, continued to gain in strength until they became a majority. So there's going to be a reaction to Johnson's ascension to power as time goes on, and it's going to only give strength to radical Republicans. After Johnson had settled down to the heavy duties of his new task, he attempted to carry out what he understood to be Lincoln's policy, omitting, however, the 10% aspect of his predecessor's program. One, he had only two objectives, union and freedom. He, like Lincoln, never subscribed to the radicals' demand for equality, however. On May 29th of 1865, Johnson announced his policy on two basic principles of Reconstruction. One, pardon and amnesty. And two, Reconstruction procedure. As with Lincoln's proclamation of December 8th, 1863, a limited pardon was extended which excluded various classes such as those who had held civil office under the Confederate government and those who had mistreated prisoners. Johnson also excluded the Southerners whose taxable property exceeded $20,000. To those accepted from the general pardon by Johnson, there remained the possibility of special pardon by petition. And much of Johnson's time was occupied in the granting of thousands of these special pardons. In fact, throughout his administration, Johnson granted pardons to former Confederates in wholesale lots and even replaced several district military commanders whose radical sympathies offended him. So a lot of politics was being played under this, the auspices of his pardoning power. During his 3 years in office, Johnson proclaimed 3 executive amnesties, each more liberal than the former. As one of his last acts in office, on December 25th, 1868, Christmas, Johnson proclaimed was an unconstitutional pardon for all Southerners, including Jefferson Davis. I mean, not unconstitutional, unconditional pardon for all Southerners, including Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, so Jefferson Davis under Johnson would be pardoned. In the Reconstruction process, beginning with North Carolina, Johnson picked up where Lincoln left off, as he proceeded to appoint provisional civil governors in all Confederate states where Lincoln had not already done so. The states were reconstructed under Johnson in the same manner that they were under Lincoln. By December 1865, regular civil administrations were functioning in all former Confederate states except Texas. Johnson's purpose was to return the American system to normal. The process involved direct personal cooperation between Johnson and the leaders of state reorganization in the South. Southern delegations conferred with Johnson in person, acquainting him with local conditionings, presenting unforeseen problems, and receiving his direct pledges of reconciliation. In conclusion, the ease and speed with Reconstruction was taking place excited distrust in the North in 3 main areas. So basically, I mean, just keep in mind, to kind of just rephrase what I went through, Johnson is making it very, very easy for the South to be reintegrated in the Union. And this is not going to sit easy with radical Republicans. They want a pound of flesh, and they want to make sure that there is a basis of equality for newly freed people in the South. So the 3 main areas are such that there's going to be problems between radical Republicans and President Johnson. Every one of the Southern state conventions rejected Lincoln's and Johnson's suggestion that the vote be extended to all, to a few well-educated blacks. Lincoln and Johnson did nothing to force the issue. 2. The second problem occurred only during the Johnson administration, when many ex-Confederate leaders were elected as officers to the restored state governments. Southern whites chose to office the natural leaders of their section, men who had been prominent in the military or civil service of the Confederacy. For example, the legislature of Georgia elected as the United States Senator Alexander Stephens, the late vice presidency of the Confederate States of America. So that's not going to sit well with radical Republicans, that the former vice president of the Confederate States of America is trying to be sent to the Senate to represent Georgia. Congress's final concern was the allowance by Johnson of a series of laws called black codes. These were passed throughout the South and restricted black people to second-class citizenship. And so that'll conclude concept 2 for this, basically, right? So there's basically a battle brewing between Congress and the presidency over Reconstruction, and over the speed of which Reconstruction is happening, a political Reconstruction, that is. Congress wants to go a lot slower to ensure that the South doesn't return, one, to some sort of de facto slavery that looks like that's very much what was happening under the Black Codes. Basically, Black Codes, a lot of what it had to deal with was it instituted a lot of vagrancy laws. So if you were caught without identification, without money, you would be arrested. And to pay off your debt to society, you can go work for the guy who owned a big black plantation down the road. which was basically slavery in all but name, right? And there you might commit some sort of infraction on the plantation, like not working hard enough, giving your overseer a bad look, talking back, whatever the case may be, and more time might be added to your term to work off your original crime, quote unquote. And so radical Republicans were very concerned that slavery was going to be reinstituted under a different name, and that African Americans were not going to be afforded any kind of political equality under Johnson being president. So they're going to try to take over Reconstruction, and that's what we'll take a look at with Concept 3.